Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah, delighted to be with you on this Tuesday to bring you another author interview. As we get started, I want to remind you, as I always do, to please like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. Very much helps the algorithm to get this podcast out to more readers such as yourselves, and it is greatly appreciated. If you want to help the podcast and the network as a whole in a monetary fashion, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. There you can leave a tip or a donation. If you would like to also leave a question or a comment while you're there, that's great. I'm happy to engage with those. I'll get to those as soon as I can after I see them. Hopefully the next episode after receiving them, but love hearing from you and answering questions or comments that you may have. Again, that link, if you want to leave a tip or a donation, is gsmcpodcast.info. You see it playing in the video next to me. You'll also see it scrolling along the bottom of that rectangle that says GSMC Book Review Podcast and has the scrolling words. That link is in the scrolling portion of that box. Your support really does mean a lot to us. It's greatly appreciated no matter what form that support takes. So thank you so much. How is your week going? Mine has been weird. I'm going to go with weird. Can't even talk about what happened over the weekend because I don't even remember it after yesterday. So you may have seen on the news that all of Portugal and Spain lost power yesterday. The entire countries. So yesterday morning, about 11:30 Portugal time, my husband and I were both working and the power went out. Okay, that happens quite frequently. It was fairly windy, so I thought, the wind, it's the wind. It'll come back in a few minutes. Of course, it happened right in the middle of one of hubby's online meetings, which was not good. But it didn't come on. A few minutes passed, it's not coming back on. I double checked to make sure it's not just our breaker, that we blew a breaker somehow. Not that. I go and check other things. No power in any other part of our complex. Come back and I'm scrolling through Facebook, and there's I belong to several expat groups and community groups and things of people in Portugal, and somebody asked, do you have power in XYZ town? I don't even remember. No, don't have power here. And then people start saying, no, they don't have power. And it's all over our region, not just our town. And then somebody says it's the whole country. And I think, well, that's odd. And then somebody posts a link saying it is both Spain and Portugal. And there was speculation as to it might have also affected parts of Germany and France. I still don't have completely clear confirmation on that. But no, all of Spain and Portugal lost power yesterday. Which is crazy. About an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours after we lost power, cell service went as well. So we had been able to be on our phones. We contacted our parents and just let them know, this is what's going on. We're okay. And then lost cell service. So for about 11 hours yesterday, we were without power, internet, cell service, and water. We also didn't have water for most of the day. We got power after about 11 hours. Some friends of ours in a neighboring town, it was another 2 hours after we got power back until they got power. So, offline hobbies. We had to figure out what we do that's offline. Thankfully, I like crafts, I crochet, I do other things. I read. Still, I usually read on my phone. I have digital copies of everything that I read for the podcast, so I could do that. Didn't need, and as long as the books were already downloaded, which the current one I'm reading for next interview was already downloaded on my phone, so I read for a while. We took the dogs for a walk. We went to the beach. Later in the evening, we went for a drive with some neighbors and just kind of seeing how things looked, and also a chance to listen to the radio because we don't have a radio anymore. Never thought, you don't even think about these things. We had a radio in the car, so we listened to that, and our friends are Portuguese, so they were able to translate the things we couldn't understand on the news. There was all kinds of speculation. They're still trying to figure out what exactly happened, but according to one thing I read today, the Portuguese and Spanish governments have both come out and said they're confident that this wasn't any kind of cyber attack, but they are trying to figure out why 2 entire countries lost power. That's my story for the week. That's I don't even remember what happened Saturday or Sunday. It has flitted out of my brain. I do not know. obviously I had an interview over the weekend because that's what I'm bringing you today. But there you go. Weird news from Portugal. What else can I say? Except that I did an interview over the weekend. So let's talk about a book because that's what you're here for. I just had to share the craziness that has been this week. This week's book is The Slate by Matthew FitzSimmons. Let me give you the description of that book. In another life, Agatha Cardiff was Congressman Paul Paxton's chief of staff, a cool-headed fixer who made all his problems disappear. At Paxton's behest, she covered up a shocking scandal that would have ruined a powerful senator's career. It was one moral compromise too far, and Agatha vowed never again. After 20 years in exile, Agatha's life in the margins of Washington, D.C. is about to become much more difficult. The rules have changed in her absence. That senator is now president, and Paxton, number 3 in the House, expects a nomination to the Supreme Court. After all, he knows where the president's skeletons are buried. At the same time, Agatha's quiet life on Capitol Hill shatters when her tenant, a woman with complex connections to D.C., vanishes. Suddenly, Agatha is drawn back into a mire of corruption, blackmail, and deception precisely when she can least afford it. Any hope of redemption won't come easy, because the true cost of Agatha's sins is finally coming to light, and it is far from certain who will pay. And so that is the description of The Slate. Again, the author is Matthew FitzSimmons. This, as you could probably tell, is a thriller. It is psychological, suspenseful, lots of things going on, lots of different levels, lots of different layers of the way politics works in DC, things you may have thought about, things you may not have thought about, things you maybe never wanted to think about. But Agatha is a really good main character because she is part of that world but also separate from it. So she was very embroiled when she was working for Senator Paxton, when she got involved in the events that opened the book and what eventually got her out of politics. But now she's just been on the margins and she's kind of in the background, not at all involved to as much as she can be. That is her choice, and she's trying to stay out of everything. But, we would have a book if that happened. She's drawn back in. You think she's just being drawn in because of her tenant, who is involved in this situation that Agatha helps her to get out of. But it turns out that everything, of course, is connected, and everything is potentially going to bring the events of 20 years ago to light, and what's going to happen, who's going to be in danger, etc., etc. It's not just from Agatha's point of view. We'll talk about that a little bit. We get a couple of other points of view that give us other insights into what is going on, not just from Agatha's story, but from a young reporter, and then from someone who is very close to the president and involved on his staff. So lots of different things. But let's go ahead and let Matthew speak about the book. Again, it is called The Slate. The author is Matthew FitzSimmons. Hi, Matthew. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. I'm excited. We're going to talk about your suspense thriller, The Slate. Before we do that, though, would you just take a moment to share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Matthew FitzSimmons. The Slate is my eighth book. My eighth book. I'm an American. I grew up in London and but my home has been Washington, D.C. since my family was relocated there when I was about 11 years old. And I've always wanted to write a book set sort of in politics and in DC, and so The Slate was sort of was finally scratching that itch and really writing sort of my version of the DC Politico thriller.
Yeah. I have a million questions about growing up until, some of your formative years in London, but I will refrain, although you probably know you probably find yourself spelling things with extra U's or.
Oh, yeah, my editors are always like, that is not how toward and towards the S on that. I have no idea which one I'm supposed to use anymore. Yeah, my vocabulary is a little bit of a pastiche at this point.
I like it. We were talking before that I live in Europe as well, and I have neighbors who are British, and so I've read a lot of literature, British literature over the years, and so I know some words, but there are times when I'm like, I could Google this, or I could just go next door and ask my neighbor.
Absolutely. Yeah.
At any rate, this is a book set in DC, so it's called The Slate. Can you give an overview of that story?
So it's a story with it's uh, an event happens in 2001, a death of an intern in a congressional office that is covered up. Um, and the book takes place 20 years later in sort of the lead up to the 2022 midterms. And the woman who affected the cover up has been out of politics for a long time and is drawn back in because the repercussions of what happened that day are now playing out in sort of the larger world. And it's one of those the retired hitman pulled back in for one more job, but in this case, it's a political hitman, not an actual assassin. And it's sort of a meditation on can you make right what was made wrong originally.
Yeah. And so obviously part of your inspiration was to have it set in Washington, D.C. You just wanted to write a book there, but what about the story itself? Was there a particular inspiration for Agatha or her storyline?
So, I mean, it's very, very loosely based, very loosely. So in 2001, the spring of 2001, is when a woman named Chandra Levy was found dead in Washington, D.C. in Rock Creek Park. She was a young political working on the Hill, and sort of her unsolved murder was sort of a very closely followed thing in Washington, D.C. and in sort of that time period. And then it sort of got lost a little bit as a national story because, of course, 9/11 happened that fall. And I actually use 9/11 as that pivot device as well, where pretty much when 9/11 happens, every news story that was being followed prior to 9/11 basically goes on the back burner.
Yeah.
Your reporters are pulled from every other, area to cover this one catastrophic event. And so things got lost in the shuffle that sometimes never got picked back up again or didn't get picked up again in time. And so that was sort of that inspiration was this thing happens in the spring of 2001 and then get just overshadowed and almost forgotten by this much larger event until 20 years later.
Yeah. And it affects 9/11 also affects the main character, Agatha's storyline, because she's out of the country on 9/11. Her flight, of course, gets canceled and she just doesn't reschedule it for 7 years.
Well,
Very oversimplified.
It's very no, but you're not right. That's actually that I was out of the country on 9/11. I was not out of the country on 9/11. I was in Ireland for my dad's wedding. My dad's wedding was I think 9/11 was on a Tuesday. I think it was a Tuesday. My dad's wedding was that Saturday.
Mhm.
And we flew back I remember flying into JFK on I think the 10th. And so, and we always talked about like if we had just been a few days later, we would have been in Ireland for, I forget how long the airports were closed, but we'd have just been there for some time.
Yeah.
So that I always remember that as being that moment.
Mhm. Can you talk a little bit more about Agatha as our
Oh,
main protagonist, sometimes an antagonist, but not totally. She's
right, right.
complicated,
No,
but
I think that I think she falls broadly into a category of character that I really like, which is sort of like the fixer character.
Mhm.
And those characters are often men,
Yes.
in fiction anyway. From mob stories, the character who sort of a character who moves behind the throne, who who cleans up the messes and sees the playing field very well. Um, and having grown up and living in Washington a long time, honestly, a lot of the fixers in Washington, D.C. are women. Oftentimes, the people who are actually in the throne are men. But if you if you look at a picture of Congress, it's mostly men. If you look at a picture of the Senate, it's mostly men. But the women who work there, are often the ones who are, you know, keeping their bosses keeping their heads above water, and I like the idea of sort of flipping that and writing, and so Agatha, I think, comes from a real line of DC women. At least I would hope so. That was my goal. But then also it was lineage to sort of like that fictional fixer character who just, who knows the move to make, the button to push, never with a gun in her hand.
So, as you can see, I started having some technical difficulties with my camera there at the end of that question. It kind of had to cut off the end of the answer, unfortunately, but I think you still got a pretty good idea of Agatha as that main character and her point of view and her place in the story. So, apologies for the technical difficulties, but they do happen. So there was some editing that was done. We're going to go ahead and take our first break of this episode. When we come back, we're talking a little bit more about the other points of view, especially a young woman whose name is Isha. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign. A sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Matthew FitzSimmons. As we get back into this second segment, your second and final reminder that if you want to help out the podcast in a monetary fashion, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info, leaving a tip or a donation, question, comment, whatever it is in you to leave while you're there, but any support is greatly appreciated. Again, that link is gsmcpodcast.info. Thank you, as always, for all of the support that you've given not only this podcast, but the network as a whole. Whatever form that support has taken, it is always greatly appreciated. Before the break, we were talking, before I had technical issues, about Agatha, the main character of the Slate. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the other points of view now as we return to the conversation with Matthew. So we have Agatha, who is really central to the story, but she's not the only point of view. So I want to talk about Isha a little bit as well, if you wouldn't mind giving a bit of a description of her character.
So you've got, so there's, I sort of wanted to get, around DC, the sort of various, when I was thinking about the book, sort of getting the various stakeholders. And I thought journalism was an important one to have as well. I wanted to have, a staffer's point of view. I wanted to have a journalist's point of view. I wanted to have Agatha's sort of outsider point of view. I like I liked her character a lot because she is, that sort of point when you're at 30 years old, where you've sort of been in a career for a minute, and there's that sense of I should have more now than that you have that, do I have my feet into this profession, or am I falling back out of it? Have I hit my ceiling? And there's that impatience to advance. And I just liked her, her doggedness and her determination, and that sort of combined with ambition and wanting to be successful, and DC is sort of filled with people. And I mean, obviously, DC is a very fraught subject right now. It's a very strange time to be here, and when people talk about DC who aren't from here, they really just think about the politicians, the elected officials, so forth and so on. But you have an incredible group of smart, talented, motivated, ambitious young people who come because they really care about an issue. Whether I've got a friend who's 29 who works at the Environmental Protection Agency, and he works there because he really cares about those issues. And it's not for glory. It's not for, appearances on the news. It's because they're smart, well-educated, and care passionately. There's a lot of passion in the city. And so for me, it was one of those, was someone who, is here because they think journalism matters as that idea of the fifth estate. So I'm being a little bit too esoteric about it, but I really liked her. I liked that just how young and brash and kind of fearless she was.
Oh, and she's kind of now at the point in her career where we meet Agatha at the very beginning. I mean, very different paths and things, but kind of in that same age range, and trying to prove themselves. So you get different stages in their lives. And so did you always plan to write it from multiple points of view? Did that kind of develop as you developed the story?
So it's a really good question. It varies book to book, but this was one where I knew I needed a couple of different points of views. That the two books I wrote previously were a single point of view character. The book's called Constance and Chance, and there's one character that you stay with the whole time, and that has its advantages and its weaknesses from a writing point of view. Because one of the challenges as a writer, if you're only going to have one character, then you have to figure out a way, and this is a little inside baseball, but you have to figure out a way to get that one character into every room that in order to advance the story, you need that character to be in the room, because they're your only eyes into the world. I'm going to stop waving my finger around. And so sometimes it tells you, like the nature of the story tells you whether you can get away with that. And there are stories where just staying with one character, you can stay with Dorothy virtually the whole way through The Wizard of Oz, because it's her discovering the world. Well, where you have a story like this, which is much more about sort of political machinations and seeing the various pieces, there is no way realistically to maneuver Agatha into a Washington Post meeting or into the White House. So you at that moment you realize, I'm going to need other characters. All right, where do I need them to be positioned in the story? And then you start to create I don't want to speak for all authors everywhere, but then you start to think about, all right, well, I need a character in the White House. Where do I want that character? And one of the things I realized, that I didn't want all the characters are relatively low level. That this was a story about the behind the scenes players. We never see the president. We never see, we never see it from the point of view of the chief of staff. It's always the staffer or the reporter. It's their point of view. So once I had that groundwork, then there's characters started to emerge for me. So
And for you, when you write characters, do you like to have a really good idea of who that character is before you start, or do you prefer that to evolve as you write?
I'm a little bit of both. You know, writers like to divide very neatly into two camps, which is sort of they like to call it the pantsers and the plotters.
But there's also
And
planters. I just smashed those words.
yeah, yeah. I didn't like any of that, so I've always called myself a road tripper, which is
Mm,
that I know where I'm starting from and I know where I'm driving to. But if I'm driving along and I see an exit sign and it says biggest ball of twine in the Midwest, then I'm going to get off and I'm going to go see what's over there.
yeah,
So I have a general road map, and then I leave myself room to maneuver, and the characters are the same way. Like I will have you know, a sense of them. I'll have an outline, I'll have a bio for them. But I think it definitely starts to evolve and shape. And then when you go back and you do your second draft, you've learned a lot about them. And as you've gotten to the end and then the second draft, you sort of bring those character discoveries back and seed it back through the whole way. At least that's
yeah,
how it's always worked for me. So,
yeah, makes
yeah,
sense. Washington, D.C. is itself a little bit of a character in the book. I mean,
for
you had
sure.
said here everything takes place there. It affects everything. And you write in your acknowledgments that a note you made to yourself of no Georgetown Metro. Did I get that correct?
That's
Can you
correct.
talk a little bit about that?
So if you grew up in Washington, D.C., and you know, there are always movies set there, you know, movies get set here. You know, I think New York City is a big place from Boston, you know, Chicago, and DC has its own set. And I think if you're from a place, if a place is like it's a real place, the people who are making the film don't always hew very carefully to the geography or the reality of the city. And there are just moments where I'm like, well, that's definitely not in DC. I mean,
Yeah,
you know, famously, like The Departed was not filmed in Boston. And if you're from Boston, you can tell that Scorsese didn't film that film in Boston. It just doesn't look like the city of Boston. So DC, you know, I remember growing up, movies like The American President, where she talks about getting lost on DuPont Circle. And I remember sitting in the audience and everyone groaning because there's no reason you would go from K Street to DuPont Circle back to the White House. K Street, the White House are right next to each other, and
yeah.
DuPont Circle's up here. So if you're from DC, it grates on you. So there's a Kevin Costner movie in I think '87. I was 16 or 17 years old, called oh my God, what's the name of that movie?
Oh, you mentioned it
No Way
too.
Out. No Way Out. Just blank for a second. Where Kevin Costner plays a Navy officer who's investigating a murder and looking for a Russian spy. And at some point, he's being chased, and he gets up on, and he's chasing these two goons, and they're on the Whitehurst Freeway, and they crash, and he jumps off, and he is on the Georgetown metro stop. And now, famously, DC does not, there is no metro stop in Georgetown. It is a famous sticking point why there's no Georgetown metro there. Like it was a very political and intense decision when they were building the metro, and famously it just does not have one. So when though I made that note to myself, I was like, don't do anything in this book where someone from DC will read this and be like, you're a buffoon. What are you doing? Like, that's not how that works. That's not what that looks like or where that is. Make the character of DC feel real to the people from here.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the same anywhere where people live, and a book is set there or a movie is set there. There's a movie set in Montana, which is where I grew up, and they drive the Beartooth Highway, which is absolutely gorgeous, but there is zero reason for this person to be
To be
driving
on that road.
from point
Yep.
A to point
Yep.
B, and everybody in the theater exactly the same was like, the heck are they doing that for?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think every book slash movie, or every location, people can tell when it's set.
They know if you know. They
Yeah,
know if you've got the details right.
exactly. So we just had a couple of examples, but what are those things? What are those details that absolutely take you out of the moment in either a book or a movie where you know too much, so you know that something is inaccurate, whether it's a detail or something that you do for a living, or maybe it's a place that you know really well and they've gotten it wrong. What are those details for you? I mentioned the one detail about the highway, that one I've seen others in, and now I can't of course think of any off the top of my head. Completely blank mind because I mentioned it, but what are those details for you? I'd love to hear them. We're going to go ahead and take our second break of this episode. When we come back, Matthew will be talking about some of the research that he did for the Slate. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Matthew FitzSimmons. Before the break, we were talking about inconsistencies, whether that's in books or movies, the things that you just can't suspend disbelief about, and it takes you out of the moment. But we're going to go ahead and return now to the conversation with Matthew. So in terms of the book itself and the story itself, was there any particular research that you did for the story?
Yes. Despite having lived in DC a good portion of my life and having this been home, I've never actually worked in politics.
Mm.
But living here and growing up here, I am very well versed in politics. And it's funny, like if I am away from DC, I'm probably the most knowledgeable person about DC and the political scene in any room.
Sure.
When I'm in DC, I'm basically an idiot. Like I have a friend who works in government who could name 400 of the 435 members of Congress. Like he just knows all their names. I know 10 or 15,
Right.
Which is pretty good, but that's it. And so a lot of the research was I sort of assembled what I would call my panel of experts, and I said, just don't let me, like I would send them drafts, like where am I off base? How would this work in the back? I never having sat in those back rooms. I did a lot of talking to. I talked to a couple of people who were chief of staffs for congressional people, and I talked to people who've worked in the White House, and so I made sure to try and get. At some point, I sent a draft out, and I had the Rose Garden oriented in the wrong direction.
Mm.
Like I've never been in the Rose Garden. I've never been in that part of the White House. I've taken the tour, but I've never done that.
Right.
I just faced it the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I got a note back like, no, the Rose Garden's over here, and the president comes out of this door and he goes to here. And I'm like, oh shoot. And so so that was the kind of research. It was like, just get those details right. So yeah. And hopefully I did a passable job. That was just my hope.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is that probably most people wouldn't know whether you got the Rose Garden, but it's one of those details that could throw someone out of the moment of the book, like anything, where they fixate on that.
I've got, that's always been my first series was about a hacker, and I had an advisor who advised on all five of them. I'm not a hacker. I can turn on a computer. I'm not completely inept, but not a hacker. And I had someone who was very knowledgeable in that world. And I was like, I want to portray hacking accurately. And then I would get emails from people in the InfoSec, the information security community that would say, thank you. It's the first time I've ever read a book where it's just not garbage. where
Yeah.
it's just not made up like hacking, not compute TV nonsense. And that, so I've always sort of had I want to write to that person, and then hopefully the people who don't know any better. It's like that show. I don't know if you watched it, if you got it where you are, but there's a show on HBO right now called The Pit.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
a
I've heard of it. I have not seen it yet. Yeah.
but it's a hospital medical show that I've read a number of articles by doctors who said like this is by far the most accurate, realistic, attention to detail, painfully so for us to watch because it is so close to what our real life is like.
Wow.
And I did watch the show and I would know, but I do feel like I could feel it. I could feel that authenticity, that passion and that care to get the details right, even though I didn't know. So that I think that's sort of part and parcel of what I like. It's, if you get it right for the people who do know, the people who don't know will just sort of feel that will feel safe in that authenticity, I
Yeah.
think.
I mean, if you were to ask me, really what I've learned about hacking from movies would be that they type really, really fast and they
Nope,
can do everything in about 30 seconds.
nope. Hacking is incredibly slow.
I would
It,
imagine.
it's
Yeah.
very, very, very careful. It's
Yeah.
painstakingly. It takes months and months and months.
Yeah.
And it's not very cinematic, which is
I would
why
think so.
Hollywood has invented you've got 30 seconds to hack this bank or I'm going to blow your brains out,
Right.
which is just not, so that's where those shortcuts, police work is another one where never watch a show with someone who actually does the job
Hmm.
described. Never watch a police drama with a police officer or a lawyer with a legal drama
My dad
because
couldn't watch anything with firefighters in it. Yeah, same thing.
corners have to be cut in order to make it dramatic and cinematic and so forth and so on. So
Yeah.
um, anyway, so
So having said all of that, but still knowing that you're writing fiction, where, where are the lines for you where it's still fiction, but you want to get things accurate, but you also know that, it has to be readable. How do you address that?
so I think the corner that I cut is for pace, is that with a thriller things need to be happening at like there's a pulse, there's a beat to a thriller. When you're reading them you want there to be sort of an acceleration towards the finish. And there are times in all of my books where things happen just faster than the real world just takes longer than you think it's going to take. The natural friction of life just slows everything down, and a thing that you think is going to take one day takes 3 weeks. That's the way the world works.
Yeah.
And fiction, that doesn't feel good. It's not interesting. It's not exciting. And so I think I over and over again will just cut. Okay, that's just going to happen. Like that's
Yeah.
just going to happen really quick because you know. But I try and make the geography accurate. I try and make the rules as close to the real world as possible, and then I just turn the pace up. Hopefully not so much so that you're like, oh, come on. Um, you saw that at the end of Game of Thrones, not to use another TV example, where by the end of it, people were traveling 3,000 miles in like 10 minutes of an episode. All of
Yeah.
a sudden it became they were on a freeway and they were zooming around this continent at unbelievable speed. And you could feel the writers going, well, we need to get that character here. We don't have to have time for him to walk, take it 4 months for him to walk there.
Yeah.
That's not dramatic. So but getting that balance right as a writer is really tough. Is like cheating, but not cheating so much where the audience is groaning at you or your reader is groaning at you.
Yeah. Probably a challenge with writing fantasy books is, they have to walk everywhere and it takes forever and it's not the most thrilling to read. I do love high fantasy, but I think the fact that they have to walk everywhere usually, depending on the book, is what gets them into trouble so often. So, it takes them a month to walk somewhere. It's not going to be a simple or easy walk because then there wouldn't be any plot or story. So they have to be attacked or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I don't need to live in a high fantasy book. But you can contemplate whether or not you want to live in a high fantasy book, or maybe you'd rather live in an urban fantasy book or some other type of genre. you do you. We're going to take our next break. When we come back, we'll talk about why Matthew prefers to write in the suspense thriller genre. You're tuned into the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Matthew FitzSimmons. Before the break, we were talking about, instead of those details that take you out of the moment because of their inconsistencies, the details that do actually need to get fudged a little bit between fact and fiction in order to make the story flow more smoothly. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Matthew. Speaking of suspense, as you mentioned, what draws you to writing suspense thrillers, that genre?
It's an interesting question. When I was younger, I had aspirations of being a more literary novelist. And when I came back to it, I didn't publish my first book until my early 40s. It was sort of my second crack at it. I wrote a book in my 20s and then took about 12 years off before I wrote another one. And my first book's called The Short Drop, and I wrote it honestly because I wanted to write something fun. Mm-hmm. I liked I'd absorbed a lot of these kinds of stories, and one of the things I liked about it was that it gave you that. What I like about genre, because I've now written thrillers, I've written a couple of science fiction books, I've written a political thriller. Right now, my current book is a supernatural thriller. So I have bounced around more than my agent probably would like, ideally. But what I like about genre is that it gives you this template, a familiar template that everyone kind of knows the beats of, mm-hmm. And then you can apply it and do really interesting things with it. You can use it to address, you can just tell a fun story, or you can use it to tackle something real and something substantive, depending on what your need for it. So I like the flexibility of sort of genre overlays, if you will.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the supernatural thriller that you're currently writing? Elevator pitch?
It's called At the Broken Places. It is about a small Pennsylvania college town that had until 1992 also been a industrial foundry town in sort of central Pennsylvania. And it is about a retired college professor from that college who restores an old Zenith radio, and that radio begins to broadcast from a radio station that no longer exists, and the central message of that the radio speaks. I found this interesting quote that said, I forget the name of the woman who said it, but it said the power of the radio is not that it speaks to millions of people, but that it speaks to millions of people individually. And I really
Mm.
liked that as an idea. So this radio speaks to everyone individually. And the message is always consistent, which is everything that is wrong in your life is not your fault. It is the fault of someone else in the town. And if
Oh,
you only dealt with them, your life would be better again. So
okay.
that's what the book's about.
Can see lots and lots of ways that that could go badly. Uh,
Almost assuredly. Almost.
yes, yes. In terms of writing, is it something that you always wanted to do? Did you grow up knowing that, or did you come to that decision later in life?
I've always, yeah, the short answer is no. I wrote about 50,000 words of a book when I was 12,
Hmm.
and then really didn't write again until my 20s. I got interested in the theater in high school. I really for a while I wanted to be an actor, but then I got interested in directing, and I did theater in college. Moved to New York after college to sort of pursue directing as a career. Um, Realized that I was not made of stern enough stuff to make it as a director in New York City. It's a tough gig and a tough
Hmm.
town. And I was living with an aspiring playwright. I was living with I was living in an endless series of illegal sublets in Manhattan. And one of my roommates was an aspiring playwright, poet, novelist. And that sort of refired that interest, and I got interested in writing again. So I wrote a novel that was not very good. For Had some good things about it, but in the end was not good enough. Um, uh, and then I wound up teaching English and theater at a high school for about 10 years. And I was like, I'm done with the arts. I'm done with uh, writing. But then working as a high school English teacher of all things sort of refired my interest in writing, and I started again, sort of quietly. I didn't tell anyone for a long time. I was a little embarrassed. When you take your shot in the arts and you miss in your 20s, there's a sort of sense of, oh, well, what do I do now? There's not a lot of fallback.
Hmm.
So yeah, so I started writing again, and so no, I was not always writing. I always had wanted to create, but it took me a while to sort of settle on writing as the way I was going to do it.
Hmm. From your experience, then, what one piece of advice might you give to someone who's thinking they might want to write?
The good, okay, so I've given this piece of advice before, but I still think it's a good one, and it served me really well, which is a thing a piece of advice that is often given is to read broadly, read everything, read a lot, read constantly. And I think that's true, absolutely true. But I think a piece of advice that's less given, and that I didn't really grasp until I was a high school English teacher, was to also read narrowly,
Hmm.
which is that, you know, the, you know, an author Kazuo Ishiguro takes about 6 years to write a novel. And then we read it, depending on how fast we read, in a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And then we finish it and we go, okay, I've read that. And then you never look at it again. Um, and whereas our favorite movies or our favorite songs, we watch or we listen thousands of times, dozens of times. We watch our favorite movies until we know like every beat of we know exactly how they did what they did. But with books, we tend to read things once and then move on. And as a high school English teacher, I wound up reading certain books 50 or 60 times.
Sure.
And it was really that process of, okay, I'm going to read Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon 50 times, where I really started to see what she was doing. And really started to understand the genius and
Mm.
and how she pulled something off, and how how did Hemingway do this? How did Fitzgerald do that? How did Toni Morrison do this? How did James Baldwin? So my piece of advice is this. I'm very long-winded. I apologize.
It's all
Is
good.
if you read something that really you put it down and you go, oh my God, that was so good. Don't stop there. Go back and read it again and figure out why it was so good. Because that
Mm.
first time you read it, you're just reading it for the pleasure of reading it, and it's great, and that's fantastic. But then get under the hood, how they structure it, how they do it, how do they bind you to that character, how do they get you invested. Why can't you put down a Stephen King book for the last 150 pages? How does he do
Mm.
that? It's not an accident, that Stephen King is one of those writers who's like, oh man, I was up until 2 in the morning finishing his book.
Mhm.
The man knows what he's up to. He's not doing it. It's not just, smoke and mirrors. He's got a technique to it. So whatever your genre is, whatever kind of book you want to write, read broadly, but then also when you find those books that really, ring your bell, stop, go back to them, read them 4 or 5 times, read them until you
Yeah.
know why.
Yeah. Thank you. Read broadly makes sense, but reading narrowly also makes a lot of sense in terms of advice for writing. So I guess everyone has to find a balance for what works best for them and what makes sense and what gives them the most inspiration and technique, etc. I don't know. Let me know what you think. If you're an author, which do you do, which works best for you, etc. We're going to take our final break of this episode. When we come back, what Matthew has been reading. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Matthew FitzSimmons. Before the break, Matthew was giving some of his advice for aspiring authors. So let's go ahead now and finish that conversation. So when you take time to read, just for you, not necessarily for research or anything else, who are your go-to authors and what are your go-to genres?
It's funny. I'm having a real crisis with that, is that I read so much for work,
Mm-hmm.
and I spend most of my day reading my own writing, that I have become a much worse reader. It's embarrassing to say on a podcast, but I've become I've become a much more difficult audience. I'm a huge fan of Jennifer Egan, um, uh, who wrote A Visit from the Goon Squad and Manhattan Beach and a number of other books. Kazuo Ishiguro, I mentioned earlier. Um, I don't have, I tend to be a generalist. I sort of jump. I try not to just read in the genre that I am writing in. I feel like that you become myopic in how you look at books. Um, most of my big authors, my go-to authors, were authors from my 20s and 30s that I read. I read everything that Ian McKellen wrote. I wrote everything that Don DeLillo wrote. I sort of went on those mad jags of reading, being a completionist. And when I've got an 11-year-old, I write full time. I become, embarrassingly, a pretty bad reader. It's really embarrassing.
I think it happens. Yeah.
I'm
Well,
trying, but I'm trying to get better. I need to practice what I preach, and it's my New Year's resolution is to do better.
there's always audiobooks if you can fit those in somewhere.
I know.
Okay, your 11-year-old, what do they like to read? If they're a reader, I shouldn't assume.
Oh, it's one of our proudest achievements is he reads about 2 hours a night.
Nice.
Our big rule with him was, I tried very briefly to sort of like feed him books that I thought, okay, you need to read this. And my partner, very wisely, she said, stop it. He's reading. Getting a boy to read is hard enough as it is. Getting him to sit still and read. He reads a lot about trains. He reads a lot about Minecraft.
Sure.
Minecraft novels, Minecraft how-tos, Minecraft this. And I find it all kind of appalling, but I'm assured that he's reading.
Reading.
Read, like, as long as the motto in the house is, as long as he's reading, we don't care what he like. If he's passionate about it and he's interested in it, that's got to be right now, and hopefully that passion will carry on, and eventually he'll start reading books that his father considers important.
Or not.
Terrible. I'm a terrible role model. I have these visions, and then the beauty of children is they, it's going to work like this, and then the child goes, oh, not going to work like that at all. They're just hanging on for dear life. But he's reading, and we're really happy about that.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, I've never played Minecraft, have no desire to read anything either written about it or set in it, or but hey, like you said, he's reading. My brother used to read encyclopedias, so whatever works.
Yeah, exactly.
If people want to know more about you or your book's website and any social media that you're active on.
I have a website, MatthewFitzSimmons.com. I pulled back dramatically from social media in the last few years. I am on Blue Sky under my name a little bit, but I have honestly become I'm more active on Letterboxd, which is a movie social media site, than I really am on any other social media right now. I've come to have a very dim view of that entire ecosystem. So
yeah.
But I do check it, and I am in there, and I will interact if gently prodded.
Yes. Okay.
Thank
you.
Come and say hello.
Perfect. Matthew, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to make sure was highlighted or you covered during this time?
No, I think you do. I really appreciate your time, Sarah. It was fun to talk about. The book came out in November, and I haven't thought about it in just a little bit. So you were asking me a couple of questions, and I was like, okay, what happened in this book? I realized I should have stopped. And it's funny, after you write a book and you start the next one, to some extent, the last book vanishes from your brain. You have to populate it with a new one. But I was really proud of the slate. I think it captured DC in a way that felt real to me. I think it's a fun story. It's it was interesting releasing a political thriller at such a fraught political moment.
Did you always plan on releasing it at that time, or did that just happen?
I pitched it to my publisher, and they had reservations about it. And I said, I want this book to be about DC, not about any one political party. So, I wrote a political thriller that actually doesn't no one is identified by party.
Just
That's,
realized that as you said it. I'm like, you know what? There's nothing in there that indicates what party anyone is from.
once you're actually here, once you're actually in the DC ecosystem, it's basically the same. I mean, that's one of the things that you start to realize is that, um, it's a complex, imperfect thing that is government, and uh, I was more interested in the machine of the city than I was in interrogating one political party or another. So it's not about that, I guess, is if people are leery to get into a political thriller because they don't want to be lectured at on this. That's not what this is about. It's a book that's intended to just sort of give you a feel for what it is like here, regardless of your political stripes. So.
No. Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your weekend to talk to me about the Slate. I really appreciate it.
I can't thank you enough, Sarah. It was really, really nice to meet you and chat.
Thank you again to Matthew for joining me to talk about the Slate. If you are a fan of thrillers, of suspense, maybe books set in a political world, books with not one but a couple of strong female characters. Actually, I mean, even from there's two whose point of view you get in Isha and Agatha, but there are other strong female characters as well. If you like the stories that have a fixer, in this case, the fixer is Agatha, so you get a point of view of a woman in this political climate and situation. There's lots of good things to recommend this particular book, especially if this is a genre that you are interested in or a subject matter that you're interested in. Always, if you this isn't your cup of tea, maybe you have a reader in your life who loves books like this. Always consider getting gifts for those readers in your life. I will always tell you to buy books for the people in your life who love to read. That's just never going to change. That's what I do. But yeah, if you are someone you know are interested in this book or any of Matthew's other books, please do, of course, check those out. Thank you again to Matthew for joining me. Thank you, as always, to you for joining me for this episode, this author interview. I hope you will join me next time. I have returning author Sophia Kuidu-Giles. I always stumble on that last name. I apologize. Sophia Kuidu-Giles joining me to talk about Circle of Peace. This is the second in a series of books. The first one talked about the goddess Circe. This one is from the point of view and a story involving Circe's mother, Perse, and different events in Greek mythology with that story. So I'm looking forward. I really enjoyed having Sophia here on the podcast about a year ago, I think it was, maybe a little less, can't remember the exact date, but I enjoyed speaking with her and I'm looking forward to having her back on the podcast. So please do join me for that episode next week. In the meantime, as always, you know what I'm going to say. If you're a fan of this podcast, please consider doing a few things. The first is to like, follow, and subscribe on whatever channel or platform you are either listening to or watching this episode on. Also, leaving a positive review is incredibly helpful to that algorithm. The world runs on algorithms nowadays. So in order to get this podcast out to more readers, to get these authors that I speak to get those books out to more readers, I love introducing you to new authors. It's about the authors. It's not about me. Don't do it for me. Do it for the authors. Do it to get more books into more people's hands. But, doing these things will help the algorithm. So, like, follow, subscribe, etc., but also leaving a positive review. Thank you in advance for doing that if you choose to. It's greatly appreciated. If you're on social media, please follow the podcast on Facebook, X, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Love hearing from you. Come find the podcast. Tell me what you're reading, which authors you've read, which authors you maybe will read now that you've heard their interviews, etc. Help me to fulfill all of my nosy questions, or to answer all of my nosy questions. You know I love hearing from you. So find the podcast on social media. In the meantime, I hope your week has been less strange than mine. What does that curse me? You live in interesting times. I don't know if I want to live in interesting times, but it has been interesting. I hope your week has been less interesting. Or if it has been quote unquote interesting, it's also giving you plenty of time to escape into a good book. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to